watched this video from the New York Times. Yes, I know that's a little bit weird. Apparently the New York Times does videos. So anyways, I've watched a lot of stupid social justice warrior videos before. This was the first one that actually made me angry. So I'm going to point out 10 blatant lies that appear in this video. Lie number 1, national identity is made up.
Nationality feels so powerful. We fight for our country, we cheer for it, we draw our values from it. It's a big way many of us describe who we are, but it didn't used to be. Up until really recently, our identities came from stuff immediately around us. Clans, religion, family. If you think about it, nationality is weird. The idea that you identify with millions of strangers just based on borders. That's because national identity is made up.
So the Times acts like national identity is some sort of modern imposter. The video suggests that it's more normal for people to identify with families, clans, and religion. This idea that national identity just sort of came out of nowhere and unjustifiably displaced these other more important identities is complete nonsense. Prior to nations, people lived in tribes, which could also be called clans. When these tribes adopted agriculture and began to become larger, they would progress to a chiefdom. The chiefdom was better than a tribe because it had centralized leadership that could create hierarchies, bureaucracy, and administer justice. If these chiefdoms became very successful, densely populated, and complex, then they would become primitive states. The chief would become a religious figure, sometimes considered a god, who ruled by divine rule. These states were more powerful than ordinary chiefdoms. If they became even more advanced, they might progress to a modern state. In a modern state, the chief is chosen by merit. The chief is so important that we still have one in our country today. The president is the commander-in-chief. People in nations no longer identify with their tribe or clan because the tribe has been replaced by the nation. There is really no difference between tribal identity and national identity. National identity has existed since the time the first chiefdoms became primitive nations. What about religious identity? Well, the original religious identities arose from nations. So nationalism would predate the religious identity. Primitive religions were usually connected to nationalism and literally involved worshiping the state and the chief. The large religions like Christianity and Buddhism, the way they were able to spread across other nations is because these religions specifically avoided setting up conflicts between their religion and nationalism. Christianity, for example, does not require someone to replace their national identity with a Christian identity. The idea is that you could be a nationalist and still be a Christian or a Buddhist. Now, what about family identity? Sure, you can primarily identify with your family. In history, it was common for people to worship their ancestors, and lineage was something that had a lot of historical significance in a lot of different cultures. The problem with the family identity is that it does not lead to a very good society. Imagine you become the manager of a grocery store. You need to hire 5 employees. You have 5 family members who are unemployed. Do you post a job advertisement and hire the best qualified people? Or do you just hook your family members up with those jobs? What if, instead of a grocery store, we're talking about a police department? I think you can see the trouble of rejecting a national identity and adopting an absolutist family identity. Lie number 2. National identity is a racist dictator myth.
National identity is the myth that built the modern world, but it also primes us for dictatorship, racism, genocide. Today, we're fighting over whether to keep that kind of national identity.
National identity is not a myth. People have lived in nations for thousands of years. The concept of a nation is not new. An example of an early nation was Babylon. Citizens of Babylon would have had a national identity. The idea that national identity is a myth is ridiculous. I identify as American. Anyone else who is American has the same president, Congress, and Supreme Court. They follow the same constitution. They probably watch the same television channels and shop at many of the same chain stores. To say all of this is a myth is ridiculous. Obviously, there are a lot of things Americans have in common. Is national identity racist? Only if you want it to be. Nazi Germany embraced national identity in a racist way because they believed it was not enough to be a German citizen to claim the German identity. To the Nazis, one has to be ethnically German. This justified mistreatment of citizens who were not ethnically German. Of course, Germany didn't have to do this. The reason they did was because Germany was traditionally populated by German people. They believed these people were legitimate and others were not. I live in America. The American national identity is not tied to a specific race. Our country's history involves the immigration of people from diverse countries into a single country. The foundation of America is its classical liberal values. Americans can identify with the nation by embracing these classically liberal values without having to accept a single American ethnicity as being legitimate. As far as national identity being connected to dictatorship, this is only true if your nation is a dictatorship. As an American, I can identify as an American while clearly saying that my American identity would stand in opposition to any sort of dictatorship. The Constitution, democracy, and freedoms in the Bill of Rights are all part of my American nationalist identity. Lie number 3, nationalism can't work in a diverse country.
So you think you know what France is? It's a place united by the French language and the French ethnicity, right? But as of the French Revolution, half of the people there could not speak French. Only 1 in 8 spoke it well. These are the languages that people spoke, just a patchwork that didn't line up with borders. We know from modern genetics that ethnicity didn't line up with borders either. National identity became the idea that language, race, and borders should add up to a country. Nations can't admit they're made up, so they invent a national mythology that says they've been like this forever.
This ridiculous video criticizes the idea that France is a nation because it is made up of different ethnic groups who speak different languages. The video then contradicts itself by concluding that the idea of national identity is based solely on shared race, language, and borders, and therefore is a naive simplification of identity. So it criticizes national identity because nations are diverse when it comes to ethnicity and language. It then criticizes national identity because it requires uniform ethnicity, language, and borders. Basically, nationalism can never win. The truth is that national identity is legitimate if people identify as living in the same nation. If their nation is truly uniform in how it operates, even in areas that are ethnically or linguistically different, then people across ethnic or linguistic groups do in fact share a national identity. It is also true that national identity does not require a uniform ethnic group or language. One of the most patriotic, nationalistic countries in the world is China. China has many different languages and ethnicities. People in diverse countries stand the most to gain by adopting nationalism. This is because it is the only identity that can bring the diverse group of people together. Lie number 4, national identity is a modern phenomenon.
The modern era brought 4 big changes that led to national identity. People moved in big numbers from the country to the city, and they needed a common language. New technology like newspapers and trains made countries feel smaller and more interconnected. War was changing into this vast, all-consuming thing. Countries needed people to care so much about their nation, they'd fight for it in huge numbers. Governments were challenging religion for power. Here's Napoleon taking his crown from the Pope to crown himself emperor. It was a big deal. These 4 things sparked an era of revolutions and democracy, but they also unleashed ideas of nationalism, militarism, and leader worship.
The second there were primitive states, there were national identities. Ancient Egypt, they identified as Egyptians. Roman Empire, the people identified as Romans. Aztecs, people identified as Aztecs. The Ottoman Empire, they identified as Ottomans. Persia, identified as Persians. The idea that the railroad, newspapers, wars, or decline of the church was the cause of national identity is unbelievably stupid. National identity predated all of those things. Lie number 5. It is wrong for someone to identify with their nation.
Rocky IV can tell us a lot about what national identity does to our brains.
The Russian towers above the American.
A 1994 study tested the attitudes of Americans watching the movie. It includes an amazing footnote. All 216 participants were women because, quote, there were no males who had not seen Rocky IV. Anyway, when Rocky beat his Russian opponent, participants who strongly identified as American felt a boost in self-esteem. When they were shown re-edited footage to make it look like Rocky lost, they felt a drop in self-esteem, and they became likelier to hold negative views about Russians. But when they said something bad about Russians, their self-esteem recovered.
There is nothing wrong for someone to watch a boxing match between an American and a Russian, and assuming they are an American or Russian, root for their fellow citizen. This is perfectly acceptable. Sure, someone can be overzealous in their nationalism, accusing the Russian of using steroids after he beat the American would be overzealous. However, you shouldn't blame nationalism on someone who reacts this way. You should blame zealotry. Nationalism is not the only thing that can turn someone into a zealot. Lie number 6. Most wars are caused by soccer games.
One study found that any country whose team plays in the World Cup becomes likelier to launch attacks abroad. That hostility also plays out against minorities and migrants who don't fit the national myth.
I read this World Cup study, and I can tell you it's complete nonsense. It only points to a single actual war that was caused by a soccer game. All the rest of the examples that it cites to are just soccer games that resulted in some sort of soccer riot. The one soccer match that did cause an actual war comes from a very strange example of what's been termed the football war. Basically, El Salvador ended up beating Honduras in a soccer match that took place in Honduras. A lot of El Salvadorians had immigrated to Honduras and were living there. The soccer match caused a soccer riot, and in that riot, people from Honduras attacked a bunch of El Salvadorians who were living there. The government of El Salvador did not approve of this and started an actual war. The war did not last very long, but around 2,000 people were killed. This is a pretty bizarre anecdote, and it's really the only real example this study gives of soccer causing a war. The study also cites to the Nazi Germany Olympics, but no one seriously believes the Olympics is responsible for causing World War II. If it were true that nationalism caused countries to act more aggressively, then you could just as easily conclude that a lack of nationalism causes a country to be weak and victimized by more aggressive countries. It is not a good reason to denigrate national identity. Lie number 7. World War II was caused by a rise of nationalism.
It only took a century for these problems of modern nationalism to culminate into World War II.
The Nazis did embrace a type of ethnic nationalism that justified some of their genocidal actions they participated in. However, saying nationalism caused World War II would be false. Germany was impoverished by the Treaty of Versailles to the point where its citizens demanded radical change. Communist revolutionaries had overthrown the government in Russia, and people feared communism would sweep over all of Europe. Japan, which wanted to form its own empire so it could compete with European countries, invaded China. Germany invaded Poland and other European countries because it feared it would either be invaded by the Soviet Union or that the poverty that was occurring in Germany would lead workers to engage in communist revolutions. Lie number 8. America invented nationalism.
This model of identity is based on an idea from the United States. Anyone can be American if you share values like freedom and hard work.
May I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty.
It's a stirring idea, but it never completely worked.
Nationalism has existed for as long as nations have existed. Roman citizens who were proud Romans were nationalists. The idea that America invented nationalism is ridiculous. Lie number 9. An American identity shouldn't exist.
The belief that being American is really about race, religion, and language also runs throughout history. So what makes a country? Which identity should matter? That fight defines so much of the world right now, and it's intensifying.
Some people think Americans need to be white. These people are known as the alt-right. Some people believe America must be Christian. These people are usually known as evangelicals. Then there are some people who have a real obvious solution to this problem. Those are the nationalists, specifically the civic nationalists. They believe people who live in America and like America should identify as Americans, not as white Americans or Mexican Americans or black Americans, just Americans. We should all unite under this national identity. We should all be Americans. Lie number 10, nationalism is a myth.
You see it in the backlash to the European Union.
We've got our country back.
You see it in how Donald Trump began his campaign.
We either have a country or we don't, and it's that simple.
The national myth is powerful. We fight for a common past and a common future. It isn't real.
Americans do have a common past, and they're going to have a common future. Stop denying reality by calling shared national experiences a myth. Why do you hate national identity so much? Why not embrace the amazing country that we live in and just be proud of it? Does America really just mean nothing to you? Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit subscribe and like the video. Thank you.